So, once more, welcome everybody to the FIBRES online webinar on strategic foresight and innovation as tools for building a competitive future. My name is Panu Kause. I'm the CEO of FIBRES Online. And in terms of the main topics of this webinar, let me once more revisit those three bullets here. I'll first present a sort of a definition of strategic foresight on how we understand it, some points of view on why we feel it, such a working methodology is important overall. That's the first part. The second part is I'll be sharing some of the experience we've gained also on where we believe foresight work itself may be heading at the moment. This part perhaps especially owes to the fact that we previously worked as a consultancy in the field of strategic foresight and management, and today we obviously being a tools provider in the field, we have had the opportunity and the pleasure of meeting and working with literally dozens of organizations undergoing development of their own foresight work and strategic management methodology overall. And some of those companies and organizations are very advanced in their work, and some are just starting. So this bullet point 2 really owes quite a lot on those discussions, and thank you for everybody who contributed. Well, the third point is then I'll introduce a couple of at least a sort of a checklist on at least a selected list of items that we believe are really important if you are about to initiate a foresight working process within your organization, or whether you are about to develop it even further. Those three bullet points. A sort of a definition on strategic foresight and its importance, our experience on where foresight work itself may be heading, and thirdly, finally, a couple of pointers on how to initiate a foresight working process within your organization. So let's get started. Sorry about that. There we go. Strategic foresight, like I said, probably no one definition on the topic, but we like to write it as simple as it is. It means the surveying the drivers of change, the expected evolution, and the potential future scenarios in your own operating environment. That's about it. And the purpose of such work is obviously typically to identify your own strategic options and new opportunities in your changing environment, and on the other hand, obviously to mitigate some of the related risks in general, to reduce those insecurities that relate to the rapid changes within your operating environment. So there we go. Typically applied such, let me once more revisit this. Strategic foresight obviously is a concept, but it's also a set of tools and methodologies that are already pretty well proven to be more successful, especially in environments that are rapidly changing, where in environments where the more traditional and even statistical methods of forecasting and market research and so on already fail in giving reasonable results or reliable results. So this is the field where strategic foresight is then mainly applied. Now let's call this a strategy wheel or whatever. My point here is just to highlight that some of the very key concept of strategic foresight and its relation to the strategic options, the choices you make in specific. One could say that the strategic foresight work starts and ends with the strategy itself and those strategic choices that you make. Somewhat like this. Let's assume, for argument's sake, let's start with that you already have your current strategic choices on where you are headed. What is your vision of the world? What are the key choices of your positioning and so on? So that sort of feeds on the first parts of the foresight work, which include continuously observing the environment. Based on the continuous observations, then to actually identify emerging trends, the development of existing trends, and the underlying driving forces, trying to understand and elaborate over the expected trend evolution from today forward. Ultimately, thinking about the trend implications, then which implications those trends will be bringing to your specific operating environment at roughly speaking, at which points in time. And all this again feeds back into your options of strategy, of your choices of positioning, and obviously ultimately to strategy execution. And let me very clearly state here one thing. In this webinar, I will not be addressing the strategy execution part more than just by a notion of it. And the notion is no strategy has value, no strategic foresight has value if there is no execution. Let me just point this out very clearly. We strongly believe in the execution. It is just this webinar that is not, the execution part is not in the focus of it. Well, that said, let me bring out a second round or a second sphere of selected strategic foresight concepts and even some methods and tools. Talking about observing the environment, you typically talk about continuously observing weak signals of change, for example. Clustering of those small observations you have, elaborating and tracking the frequency of such observations over time. How does that develop and so on? Leading to perhaps ultimately really identifying new trends and especially the driving forces impacting the trend evolution for future. And this, you might argue that this part here, the identifying trends and driving forces, is sort of one of the culmination points of strategic work in itself. And that's the in-depth part of really trying to work on the systemic impacts of and interlinkages between trends and underlying driving forces, underlying values, even societal values that actually carry significance on how even for example, a technology trend might develop over time. I'll get back to that a bit later on. Assessing trend evolution, well, there are a couple of concepts here as well. Obviously, one needs to say that there of course are quantitative trends, such as, for example, the development of demographics in a given area. But the strategic foresight work perhaps even more emphasizes the qualitative aspects of trends, the qualitative trends that are not that well quantifiable, but rather relate to different types of conceptual value-based trends and changes in the environment. Infection here means the assessment of potential the assessment on how a given trend travels not only from geography to another, which is obviously an easy part, but also how it travels from a domain to another. I'll visit that a bit more in later on as well. Game changers is just a concept here, or some of the trends will become real game changers. A simple and a typical example here might be that the introduction and evolution of the internet has been a game changer in the sense that it fundamentally impacts every freaking business there is anywhere in the world, more or less impacts almost every individual, globally speaking. So and changes the rules of the game even more so, bringing the platform, digitalized services, and so on. You get the point. It's ultimately a game changer for any existing or previously existed business and an organization. Well, trend implications, then just a couple of points there. Futures Wheel is a pretty simple tool for assessing and working, elaborating over the potential implications of one given trend typically, whereas the scenarios of the operating environment, sort of traditionally speaking, might be considered perhaps not the end point of strategic foresight really, because it still needs to connect to the strategy itself. But scenarios are deep, multifaceted descriptions of potential future business environments, alternative environments, viable. Perhaps some of those are scenarios that you would wish to become, and some not, and so on. But you typically work with alternative futures. Point here is not to try and forecast the actual future, but to use that as a discussion tool, especially going forward, to elaborate your current strategic options and choices via, for example, action scenarios, which might be different for the different operating environment scenarios, that it gives you the room to actually discuss your options for real strategic positioning in future, and elaborate over strategic horizons, which is a really, really important topic. I'll get back to that later on, and so on. And ultimately, then there is the execution part, but like already said, I will not be addressing that topic in this during this webinar at all, more than just by the sheer notion. So there's quite a lot of stuff, and this is sort of scratching the surface really, but quite a lot of stuff. So a couple of more pointers here, selected key points here about the observing of the environment and about the assessment of trend evolution as well, the observation frequency and infection const. Let me just briefly visit those once more. In this simple illustration, time travels left to right, and the curve here roughly explains or outlines how a given trend might develop from some small local observations and or weak signals. Both the frequency and spread of those observations, if those develop heavily over time, one could argue that you ultimately, those have become a real trend or even a mega trend, such as globalization or whatever. An example here might be that I'm sure quite a few of us know the concepts of crowdsourcing and the sharing economy. Now, during the past few years, and during quite a short time, really, the amount of those observations and the global spread of observations and the infection from the domain to domain has been really, really rapid. There's sharing of office spaces, there's sharing of development resources, sharing of tools, vacation homes, boats, whatever and whatnot. So that's just on the topic of of frequency and spread of observations, the frequency and the infection of observations, ultimately having a clear being a clear indicator of a trend really developing. I also mentioned that in a sense the underlying understanding the underlying values working as a key driver for the development of trends is really important. Let me visit that as well. One of the key questions, obviously, is that once you start observing something, that there's a new phenomenon ongoing, or you're seeing a lot of new weird stuff ongoing, you pretty fast you would really wish to obviously understand whether the expected development of what you are seeing is just a hype craze or a fad, rapidly up, but even more rapidly down in frequency, or whether that you are seeing in the early phases of development that would actually develop into a trend or even a really, really long-lasting and globally spread megatrend. Let me give you another simple or even a silly example here. We probably all know the concept of selfie sticks. You know those poles that people stick their handheld, mobile phones onto and take photos of each other. Sorry, of themselves, obviously. Now, I don't know, but I would strongly argue that the selfie sticks themselves are probably just a hype, craze, and fad. I'm having really, really hard time believing that in 30 years' time there are like a gazillion people walking around with sticks in their hands and taking photos. But that's not the point there. But going to understand the underlying values and the needs that have resulted into the introduction and spread of selfie sticks, you'd soon probably start thinking about that. Yeah, well, the underlying thing is that the people wish to record their own lives and those of their close ones. They want to share their experiences, again, with their loved ones and even to the wider audience. And once you start thinking about that, you soon realize that it's sort of the same underlying values, even if their simplest form, are more or less similar that have given rise to the entire development of social media in many of its ways. Now, if you combine such thinking about the technological advancements, then the technology trends, you probably start, seeing the systemic interlinkages between the potential trends, and perhaps have a better ground on really trying to understand where would all those trends jointly possibly lead into. Even today, we already see not only selfie sticks, but with technology advancement, we see, drones with cameras tracking, skiers or runners or hikers or whatnot. And given time, 15 years, for example, where might all that lead? Well, that's about a silly example on the understanding of underlying values and the interlinkages between the different trends that is highly, highly important with strategic foresight work. Well, now I promised to address the question on why do we think this is really important. And let me come back to this strategy itself and introduce the concept of strategic horizons. Now, again, time flows left to right here, and let's assume present time is right there, and let's assume the black fixed line or curve there represents the expected development of your current business. Now, the point here is that take any business throughout the history of mankind, any existing existing way of doing business, any existing technology, business model, earnings, logic, whatnot, all of those ultimately have reached their maturity and ultimately turned into decline. Why is that? Because ultimately something new comes and replaces the old way and sort of becomes the new standard, the new normal. And whilst doing so, you soon realize that obviously there is the third horizon as well. And this cycle has been ongoing, like said, throughout the history of mankind. And I argue it will continue going on. And the really, really funny part or sad part or important part here is that let's assume that the time point here on the left is indeed now. And let's assume you are running your current business on the black curve there right now. The point is somebody somewhere is working on those horizons 2 and 3. And the difficult part here obviously is that can you be working in some sort of a balance? You'll be putting a lot of effort on the current horizon, obviously, but what are you doing on those second and third horizons? And the strategic foresight work mainly or typically and traditionally relates to the horizon 3, perhaps even more so. Just to point out once more the radical developments that might be a result of this thinking or examples of this thinking. There once were mechanical typewriters. Then came the electronic typewriters, and then came the personal computer. And none of the mechanical typewriter makers, manufacturers made even the first leap. That's what I'm saying, and that's why this thinking is really important. Now, a couple of words on the second topic on our experience on where foresight works itself may be headed. First off, just once more revisiting that there's even scientific proof on that the investing in a suitable manner on the right suitable strategic foresight capabilities, it actually results in sustainable results. You might outcompete the average by even a 33% higher profitability and a 200% higher growth in market capitalization based on a pretty recent study by Mr. René Rohrbeck, just as an example here. Now, I already mentioned the scenarios of the operating environment being a traditional key discussion item here for strategic foresight work, but the point is that the way we've understood that the companies and the organizations who have really invested in their foresight work, to an extent at the moment, I'm not going to say you should not be working on scenarios, but what I am saying that at least some of the companies feel that there's quite a lot of work and the discussion per se is obviously valuable, but perhaps the input-output ratio is not where it's supposed to be. And even more specifically, it seems as if the scenarios, even if they're valuable for the top-level strategic work, they are pretty hard to connect with the daily operations and the daily work of, your entire personnel. I think that's one of the problematics here that at least some of the organizations are facing. So it's just, in a certain sense, it's too high level. And for this reason, there's an alternative route or a more rapid route into using the same methodology of strategic foresight, but then taking it in a more rapid loop, also into a more specific context of given trend elaboration in a given innovation context. In-depth elaboration, agile experimentation, later perhaps mainstream adoption, and certainly continuous feedback on what we can learn in an even more fast-paced loop of real executional innovation, and not just via the more traditional foresight and strategy process. So that's at least one thing that is ongoing. That first box there says almost the same. So it seems to me that some organizations really wish to build on the even more direct connection of strategic foresight and trends understanding to daily activities. To some extent, that this may lead to the diminishing role of actual scenarios work and to the increase of the meaning or the importance of service design and program management being or gaining feedback, gaining input from the continuous trend work that is being run via foresight methodologies. A second development, not surprisingly, is about engagement and collaboration throughout your own organization, reaching in a more or less transparent manner, not even to customers and partners, so that the continuous work on understanding on what really is ongoing in your business environment and where that might be leading to is really more collaborative and engaging throughout the entire organization, and not just a market intelligence team or similar. Thirdly, no surprise, but market understanding and strategic foresight has always been about broad perspectives and cross-industry focuses, but at the moment, this is, the importance of this is really heightened, because it just seems that those major disruptors and rapid developments more and more seem to be coming outside of the usual suspects, outside of your current industry domain and so on. So it's just, to highlight the real importance of those broad perspectives and cross-industry understanding. And finally, also in this field, tools development, big data analytics, AI type of implementations are obviously being developed both to work on the understanding of your internal trends and those perhaps quantitative trends and intelligence, and a similar type of tool being applied to the observing and collaboration on the external business environment, which is typically the major domain of strategic foresight. At least those four developments seem to be ongoing. Now, like promised, just final notes in a checklist type of a manner on some of our thinking on what to consider when starting this type of work within your organization. First off, why do you do this? What are the objectives? Like in any new initiative, you obviously need to consider, why really are you doing this? What's wrong with the old way? Is this about the top level strategy tool? Is it about the more rapid input for innovation, or is it perhaps it's even something more, or perhaps it's a combination? You need to be clear about that. Second, how do you actually organize now, and how do you expect to organize in future for, let's say, broadly speaking, in the domain of market intelligence really, and strategic planning really? How many people are or should be involved? What's their real level of commitment to such work? Is there a value of a collaborative approach in the field? In some cases there perhaps is not. In some cases, the collaboration and the discussion itself is, even more important than than the detailed outcomes of the work itself, because it's about a lot about sharing of information, and that in itself leading to positive impacts and so on. Thirdly, what really are the expected inputs and outputs for the different participants? Point being, if you wish to engage more and more people would also expect to understand what's their role. What do they gain out of it? If people are just expected to contribute to something without no real value, no real contribution to their own work, then well, you know what I'm going to say. And finally, in our experience, this type of working methodology really does not run by itself. It will not start by itself. It will not run by itself. So you need to be clear on who and where and how you organize for the facilitation roles and responsibilities for such work. And about that, then there's a third block of stuff about an assessment of your current capabilities, organizational capabilities, I mean here. What's the cultural readiness? Some feel this is just another way of, spending time on stupid stuff. Some will say that. So the point being, is there real cultural readiness for such work? Do you really believe in the real value? Are you ready for the contradictions that might and should also be upcoming if you do the work right, and so on? What are the capabilities for organizing and applying the work? Organizing, I already mentioned on who's responsible for what, but let me stress the point of view of applying the work, the results of strategic foresight. If there are just, if you build a strategic foresight working methodology and a process with no real linkage to actual work, to actual execution, you've got a hard time coming, because it just does not carry a standalone value. Thirdly, of course, there are budgetary considerations you should pay attention to. It doesn't come for free. And finally, a bit of a different point of view here, but what are the information sources you are already using, and what's the level of ambition perhaps? Is there a readiness to use a reasonable set of information sources is the key question here. And now I think this is practically my last slide. Just the final 5 starting points for organizing this work. Point 1, true value added, we believe, becomes only when this is a continuous activity. Well, I've personally been part of one of type of endeavors on horizon scanning and scenarios and so on. There's some value in that itself, but really you need to make it into a continuous activity to really gain true value out of the sort of investment into this work. Second, participant diversity is important. You really need diversity, because the point here is to elaborate about not only the assumed future. This is not about forecasting. This is about understanding alternative possible futures and playing your strategy against those different alternative futures. So you need diversity for those important contradictions and alternative views. Thirdly, well, I've said this repeatedly, just once more, a real connection to your own real strategy or daily activities is crucial. It rarely carries a standalone value in change management or foresight work itself alone. Fourthly, well, we are excited about this work. There are quite a few people around who are, and you might be surprised on how difficult it really is to have your own crew participating and getting excited, and especially getting excited in the long run. So point here is you need to make it easy for people. You need to make it fun. You need to make it worthwhile. There needs to be a real value to the people themselves for their work, and you need to give it time. Time in 2 senses at least. One, it takes time to get the ball rolling in calendar weeks, months, and so on. The other thing is that you need to make sure that people understand that it's okay to spend part of your, your work day on such elaborations and so on. And finally, fifth, make sure people understand which strategic horizon you and they are working on when they are working with strategic foresight related things. And this is really, really important. The majority of people, by definition, in their daily roles are working on Horizon 1, on the optimizing of current status of things, making it at high profitability and so on, and they should. However, strategic horizons 2 and 3 are the ones where you typically apply your strategic or foresight type of work, and people need to realize this. It's not about their daily activities. This is about the future. This is a different thing. Now, that said, I'm all done for this webinar. Let me just, thank my colleague Maya and Heli, who actually put up this webinar. It would not exist without them, and obviously to other colleagues as well. We'll be starting discussions and questions in just a while, but let me once more say that thank you so much. And another point I wish to stress is that you'll get a feedback questionnaire after the webinar and after the question session, so that I specifically hope that you might comment on what parts of this presentation might be the most important to you, which parts you would like to have more in-depth discussion on and elaboration on and so on. Point being that we are working on a series of webinars in the field. I would just like to get the feedback on where you feel we could bring even more value to you guys. Once more, thank you on my behalf, and now let's start with the discussions and opening the chat box here.